He turns to rally the light infantry. One British lieutenant recalls what happens next.
He had scarcely entered the wood when an American rifleman singled him out. He fired the ball, true to its mark, pierced his side.
An anonymous sniper strikes down the commander of the British land forces. Ross falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Moments later, British fire fells the American rifleman. Growing weaker, Ross issues his last order. He yields command to Colonel Arthur Brooke, then dies. News of Ross's death quickly spreads through the ranks. Midshipman Robert Barrett expresses the shock shared by many in the British invasion force.
I can vouch that the lamented Major General Robert Ross was regarded by all ranks as a chivalrous hero whose humanity and bravery were equally conspicuous, and that his memory will never die in the regiments he so often led to victory.
The sniper's name has faded into history. With one shot, he would never know how he had changed the course of the War of 1812.
The tragic death of Ross affected the British Army in a very significant way. He was a known quantity. They knew what they could expect from him, and they trusted him. The British Army at this stage were in something of a quandary.
For the British, Major General Ross's death means more than just losing a leader. What was once an invincible juggernaut has experienced the first chink in its armor.
Imagine if Eisenhower had been shot the day before D-Day. That's what happened here. Ross was killed by a sniper, and the organization went into shambles. Men who really loved that general weren't so quick to turn to his replacement for leadership.
Had he lived, Ross might have emerged as the battle's most well-known figure. But now, that distinction will belong to a lawyer detained on an American truce vessel several miles away. His name, Francis Scott Key. The British invasion force continues its combined naval and land attack on Baltimore. Their battle plan suffers a significant early blow when a bullet from an American sniper kills General Robert Ross. The loss of their commander has sent shockwaves through the British Army. Ross is temporarily replaced by Colonel Arthur Brooke, an able but cautious leader. The British quickly realize that this will be a very different battle than the one just a few weeks earlier.
Brooke is in a quandary. He's against a much stronger American position than at Bladensburg. Stricker knows his business. Stricker anticipates Brooke's moves. He seems to read him like a book. As a result, every time the British columns move against the American position, Stricker dispatches troops in reserve to flesh out and harden up that defense.
To breach Stricker's defense, Brooke orders an artillery barrage. Bursts of projectiles and Congreve rockets cause confusion in the American ranks. Through clouds of musket smoke, British Lieutenant George Gleig remembers the fog of war.
Volley upon volley having been given, we were now advanced within less than 20 yards of the American line. Yet such was the denseness of the smoke that it was only when a passing breeze swept away the cloud for a moment that either force became visible to the other.
Stricker, seeing his line threatened by oncoming British forces, calls for a retreat. But unlike the militiamen who scattered at Bladensburg, he retires his troops in good order to the very outskirts of Baltimore. Meanwhile, in the harbor, Major George Armistead, the commander at Fort McHenry, views the approaching British fleet from the ramparts.
Prepare to fire! Sir, they're out of our range! Give your guns full elevation.
From the number of barges and the well-known situation of the enemy, I have no doubt but that an assault will be made this night upon the fort.
Aboard the 50-gun frigate HMS Surprise, Captain Edward Codrington reflects the confidence of the British Navy in a letter to his wife.
The work of destruction is now about to begin, and there will be many broken heads tonight. The bomb vessels, brigs, the frigates are all pushing up the river with an eagerness which must annoy the enemy, I presume as much as it delights me.
Dawn, September 13th. The bombardment of Fort McHenry commences. From their position 2 miles away, heavily armed British bomb ships unleash an early 19th century version of shock and awe.
This is the most powerful, destructive force known to man in 1814. 1,500 of these are thrown at the fort, exploding 190-pound cast-iron bombs. This is what's striking fear into the hearts of the Baltimore defenders.
Miles from Fort McHenry, the citizens of Baltimore feel the power of the British artillery volleys. A local newspaper reports.
The houses in the city were shaken to their foundations, for never, perhaps from the time of invention of cannon to the present day, were number of pieces fired with so rapid succession.
8 miles away, a 35-year-old Georgetown lawyer named Francis Scott Key watches the bombardment aboard an American truce vessel. Just prior to the battle, he had arrived at the British fleet in Chesapeake Bay to secure the release of a friend. But before they can leave, the bombardment of Fort McHenry begins, and they're trapped. Key now finds himself in the middle of the storm.
Francis Scott Key is amazed and appalled by the bombardment that's going on. The absolute foundations of both Fort McHenry and Baltimore are being rocked by these 200-pound bombs that are being hurled at the fort.
As the Royal Navy bombards Fort McHenry, Colonel Arthur Brooke resumes the infantry attack on Baltimore. When he comes on the position in Hampstead Hill, he is amazed at what he sees. Strongly emplaced American troops behind extensive earthworks, well armed with artillery. While the British infantry advance on Baltimore, the bombardment of Fort McHenry continues into the afternoon. Heavy rain and 13-inch mortar shells deluge the fort. At about 2 p.m., a mortar shell arcs over the walls, killing a gun commander and wounding several soldiers. Private Isaac Monroe recalls the devastation inside the stronghold.
Sergeant Clem was killed by my side, a bomb bursting over our heads. A piece the size of $1, 2 inches thick, passed through his body.
Moments later, a bomb makes a direct hit on this powder magazine, where over 250,000 pounds of powder are being stored. This is the main powder magazine for the defense of Baltimore itself. If this goes, the entire fort will go. If the fort goes, the city may very well fall.
But miraculously, the shell fails to ignite, saving Fort McHenry from utter destruction. Despite the unprecedented onslaught, American troops inside the fort counter the attack with lethal force of their own. By nightfall, the bombardment has lasted more than 12 hours. The sky over Fort McHenry is ablaze with lightning and rocket glare, as deafening thunderclaps and artillery blasts shake and rattle all of Baltimore. One U.S. Marine is awestruck by the dazzling but deadly sound and light show.
I think the handsomest sight I ever saw was during the bombardment, to see the bombs and rockets flying.
An order comes to extinguish the lights in all of Baltimore to prevent the British from seeing any strategic landmarks. Now, only the periodic flashes of lightning and exploding rockets illuminate Fort McHenry. Inside, Major Armistead and his men know they must hold out. The fate of the city, perhaps the nation itself, is in their hands. The only way Francis Scott Key and the people of Baltimore will know if they're successful is if the flag above the fort still waves. They watch, hope, and wait. Throughout the night of September 13, 1814, the British Navy keeps up its bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. One British midshipman recalls the relentless artillery attack.
All the night, the bombardment continued with unabated vigor. The hissing of rockets and the fiery shells glittered in the air, threatening destruction as they fell. Whilst to add solemnity to this scene of devastation, the rain fell in torrents. The thunder broke in mighty peals after each successive flash of lightning.
Inside the fort, with the smaller storm flag now flying above, Major George Armistead's men return fire.
The only means we had of directing our fire was by the blaze of their rockets and the flashes of their guns.
Those citizens of Baltimore who haven't already fled the city look on in awe and horror.
And Francis Scott Key is one of them. Throughout the night, he paces the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if there's silence, it might mean the fort had capitulated.
While the Royal Navy shells the fort, Colonel Arthur Brooke, commander of the British Land Force, prepares a final attack on Hampstead Hill on the edge of the city. To aid Brooke, Vice Admiral Cochrane orders a diversionary attack against the western slope of Fort McHenry with a flotilla of 20 barges armed with artillery. But the Americans don't fall for the ploy. Instead, the American artillery pounds away at the diversionary force. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14th, Brooke makes a momentous decision. He orders a retreat back to the ships.
September 14th, dawn. At 4:30 in the morning, the American gun batteries here at Fort McHenry fall silent. But the bombardment continues until 7:30 that morning by the British Royal Navy. And then after 25 hours of intense bombardment, silence covers the waters of the Patapsco River and Baltimore Harbor.
That silence follows the order to stop the bombing of Fort McHenry. The nighttime flotilla operation had failed. All the while, the ragged, rain-soaked storm flag still waves defiantly over the fort's ramparts. Cochrane understands that to continue fighting is futile. One by one, each British warship that only minutes before had unleashed an unprecedented eruption of artillery and rocket fire now weighs anchor and quietly sets sail into the morning mist. An American officer recalls the sight.
The enemy has been severely drubbed, as well by his army and his navy, and now it is retiring down the river after expending many tons of shot, from 1,800 to 2,000 shells, and at least 700 or 800 rockets.
It is a moment to remember. It is a moment now that would define the importance of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, because something is about to happen.
Major Armistead quickly replaces the tattered storm flag by hoisting, as one British observer noted, a most superb and splendid ensign on the battery. The enemy has no trouble seeing it.
But gradually, the morning mists began to clear, and once more Key makes out the stars and stripes still flying above Fort McHenry. Never before has he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country.
Francis Scott Key, a reluctant patriot himself, a person who was not terribly political and somebody who was against the war itself, finds himself an eyewitness to this moment in American history.
I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and the pride of my native state. And does not such a country and such defenders of their country deserve a song?
Key takes out a letter from his pocket and jots down a few verses.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light.
The British release Key later that morning. He returns to Baltimore and continues to work on his poem.
what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming.
A few days after the bombardment, Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, is printed on handbills and distributed throughout Baltimore.
Whose broad stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming.
The poem is put to the melody of To Anacreon in Heaven, a popular British drinking song from the late 1700s.
And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there.
By November 1814, the song is published in Baltimore as the Star-Spangled Banner. Soon, other cities publish the song, and it gains popularity.
Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
Congress officially approves the song as the national anthem in 1931.
Or the land of the free and the home of the brave.
The night of September 14th, 1814, fireworks again explode and light up the sky over Baltimore, this time in celebration.
So there were huge celebrations, fireworks and dancing, and the best letter that was written at the time came from a lady in Philadelphia who wrote to her father, and she said, "Papa, there are loud huzzahs, that's hurrahs, in the streets. General Ross is killed, Baltimore is saved." There were fears, she wrote in another letter, that the Americans might have to swear allegiance to the British crown again. That's how high the stakes were to some people.
But an entire ocean away from Baltimore, a major development takes place that will affect the course of the war. British and American representatives begin peace talks in Ghent, Belgium.
The first efforts to negotiate happened in the middle of 1813 when the Russians agreed to mediate a settlement between Britain and the United States. That didn't amount to anything. Madison had the commissioners stay in Europe and try to work on peace some other way.
Both sides want to negotiate from positions of strength. To counter the growing American momentum, British Vice Admiral Cochrane plans an assault on New Orleans, the gateway to the North American interior. A victory there would allow the British to link up with Canada and control the United States from the north, south, and west. But one man stands in their way. His name is Andrew Jackson. In December 1814, events on and off the battlefield will take the War of 1812 into an unprecedented direction. While representatives of the U.S. and Great Britain continue to negotiate a peace agreement in Ghent, Belgium, anti-war Federalists from New England meet in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss an alarming idea: secession from the United States. A country under attack by foreign invaders is now threatened by its own people. For the Madison administration, it is nothing short of a crisis.
They knew that British agents were in Hartford talking to the New England politicians there, and that there might be a secession movement. It looked like the whole thing might unravel.
With political developments at a critical stage, the British target New Orleans, where a decisive victory could threaten the unity and independence of the United States. But standing in their way is Andrew Jackson, a 47-year-old Tennessean whose indomitable will, battle-hardened guts, and fiery temperament earns him the legendary nickname Old Hickory.
Andrew Jackson is a pugnacious individual. He's fought duels, and when he takes command of the army, lodged between his lung and his heart is a bullet. He's racked by dysentery, and yet that indomitable will pervades. And Jackson is a man to be reckoned with. Few cross Andrew Jackson, and those that do rarely walk away.
As commander of the U.S. 7th Military District, Major General Jackson must oversee the defense of New Orleans. The pending fight will be more than just a military assignment. It's a chance to exorcise a deep hatred dating back to his youth when he was taken prisoner by the Redcoats during the Revolution.
Some say it comes from the scar on his face inflicted by a British officer with his saber. when Jackson refused to clean his boots, but it's deeper than that. Both his brothers and his mother have died of disease, the result of the brothers' captivity in Great Britain's hands. As Jackson's hate for the British grows, he begins looking for payback, and the War of 1812 offers the opportunity for that payback.
Jackson expressed this feeling to his wife, Rachel, at the beginning of the war.
I owe to Britain a debt of retaliatory vengeance. Should our forces meet, I trust I shall pay the debt.
But Jackson's thirst for revenge was about to clash with an unexpected adversary, the President of the United States, James Madison.
Think of these two men, Jackson and Madison. Physically, they're so different. Jackson's really tall and dynamic and vigorous military leader, and you've got Madison, who's brilliant, formally schooled, very erudite. They couldn't be more different in the way they work with other people and just the way they look.
Earlier that year, Madison had opposed Jackson's promotion to general, which was done without his consent. But despite Madison's personal dislike of the renegade, Jackson is the only man who can save New Orleans. Jackson arrives in the city on December 1st, 1814. He boldly promises to drive their enemies into the sea or perish in the effort. He acts immediately to organize the city's defenses. At once, all was bustle at New Orleans, wrote one resident. Jackson was untiringly active. Following his lead, New Orleanians of every ethnic background and social class unite to prepare for the defense of their city. Even men from as far away as Kentucky poured into the area, ready to fight. While New Orleans bustles before battle, Jackson recruits an army, illustrating the magnetic power of his charisma.
Andrew Jackson is one of the most dynamic Americans in the entire history of the country. This is a man who, by sheer force of personality, can galvanize the ordinary man in the street to take up arms and have the vigor of a professional soldier. He literally got people off the street to help defend New Orleans, and it was the sheer dynamism of his character.
If ever a diverse force had been collected to defend the United States of America, it is at New Orleans. Regulars, frontiersmen, volunteers, French-speaking Creoles, Indians, pirates. A truly diverse and almost motley accumulation of men.
You have America, so to speak, in all of its colors and languages, if you will, the common man. Would they have the discipline to stand and not retreat, not run, and obey the commands that were given?
Jackson will soon find out the answer. His ragtag army of nearly 4,000 mostly untrained men doesn't appear to stand a chance against the 10,000 British troops headed their way. By December 1814, the British invasion force has a new commander of ground forces, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham.
Sir Edward Michael Pakenham is one of the most popular officers in the British Army. He's won a great reputation wherever he served. So this is a man who the troops really look up to.
On December 12th, fishermen sight the British Armada at the entrance to Lake Bourne. When the news reaches New Orleans, citizens panic, but Jackson doesn't. Instead, he puts the city in lockdown.
Establishing some kind of order so that a resistance could be established against an invader necessitated, in his mind, the declaration of martial law. Because he really thought that the native population would cooperate with the British, would just say, take over the city, don't burn it, please. Don't do anything, that would harm us. And Andrew Jackson was determined, I think, to burn the city himself if necessary. But he wanted those people to stand with him, behind him, to repel the British invasion.
On December 14th, as the British advanced towards New Orleans, they engage a small American gunboat flotilla on Lake Bourne. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans stand and fight until nearly every man is killed, wounded, or captured. The action slows, but does not deter the juggernaut. An advance column sludges through swamps and bayous until it reaches the Villeray plantation, about 8 miles from New Orleans. First, the British capture several members of the local militia. Then they decide to wait for the main body of the force to catch up, instead of heeding the advice of their officers to press on and take the defenseless city by surprise. It's a mistake they will soon regret.
That's the turning point, I think. The British had many more troops. They should have pressed on. They would have taken the city, I think. But they didn't. They thought that Jackson had in excess of 20,000. He had less than 3,000 or 4,000.
But the British command has no option. They are caught between the Mississippi River on one side and a swamp on the other. The only way now is to go straight ahead.
So they have to hit the American lines, hit them hard, break the line, and get through. And Jackson is determined to hold that line. And rather than wait for the British to attack, he attacks them first.
By the eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil, Jackson declares when he learns the British are only a few miles away. He immediately orders a force of some 1,500 men to ambush the British camp. The 14-gun Carolina parallels the infantry as it sails down the fog-shrouded Mississippi towards the unsuspecting enemy camp. December 23rd, 7:30 p.m. With only the light of the British campfires to guide them, the guns of the Carolina open fire. The attack, remembers one British soldier, catches the camp completely by surprise.
Flash, flash, flash came from the river. The roar of the cannon followed, pouring a perfect shower of grape and round shot into the camp.
Following the Carolina strike, the American infantry attack. The fighting in the fog and smoke becomes intense and chaotic. Soldiers clash with bayonets and fire at point-blank range. Some of the untrained militia fire back wildly and hit their own men in ferocious hand-to-hand combat. British units counterattack, forcing the Americans to withdraw. Less than 24 hours later, and 6,000 miles away, the British and the Americans come together, not on the battlefield at New Orleans, but at the peace table at Ghent.
The Treaty of Peace is signed in Belgium on Christmas Eve, 1814. But it takes 4 to 6 weeks for word to cross the Atlantic in those days, too late for armies squaring off at New Orleans.
While peace is at hand, both sides prepare for what will be the bloodiest battle of the war. Andrew Jackson organizes his force in a ditch just 5 miles from the city. Here we shall plant our stakes, he reassures his men, and not abandon them until we drive these redcoat rascals into the river or the swamp. 4,000 men, entrenched in mud, are stretched over a mile from the Mississippi River on the west to its easternmost rampart in the swampy woodlands. Meanwhile, the British advance toward the city quickly becomes a quagmire.
They push up from Lake Bourne, and they're using their small boats, the ship's boats and barges, cart the British Army up, piecemeal fashion, to embark operations against the Americans. There aren't enough boats. They're exhausted. It's been a long, hard campaign. Morale's dropping.
As the fog lifts on New Year's Day, 1815, the British guns open fire, taking the Americans by surprise. Solid shot, exploding mortar shells, and Congreve rockets can be heard throughout New Orleans. Old Hickory calms his anxious men.
Don't mind those rockets. They are mere toys to amuse children.
The American gunners immediately return fire, and artillery rumbles for the next 3 hours. But the hastily assembled gun emplacements cannot protect the British. One by one, their artillery pieces fall silent, some nearly out of ammunition. A British soldier expresses his dismay.
Even this artillery attack, upon which so much reliance had been placed, was found to be of no avail.
Although the artillery attack has failed, General Pakenham believes he can still smash Jackson's line if he uses his most powerful tactic, a full-out charge on the city. But Jackson will be ready for him, setting the final stage for the Battle of New Orleans. On January 7th, 1815, after weeks of holding off the British invaders, Andrew Jackson's ragtag army of 4,000 men lie in wait. At any moment, the inevitable attack will begin. The Battle of New Orleans will be the climactic showdown of the War of 1812.
As the evening of January 7th appears, the men behind Line Jackson know that an attack is imminent. They can hear the sounds directly in front of them, and yet their morale is extremely high because in their mind, they have beaten the British twice. And they feel themselves almost invincible, each man relying upon that piece of wall that he himself has constructed. And it is their morale, coupled with good luck, which will turn the tide of the battle.
Just outside the city, thousands of reinforcements led by General Pakenham intend to overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers and take advantage of a glaring weakness in their defense.
Jackson's line appears weakest on its flanks. They can be easily turned, or at least so it's thought. And if those flanks can be turned, the American line will disintegrate and be rolled up and become untenable.
Pakenham devises a well-coordinated attack along the American line. Nearly 1,000 men will cross the Mississippi on the west bank, attack the American artillery batteries, and turn the guns on Jackson's own men.
With the West Bank taken, General Pakenham can begin his main attack. He has 3 columns. On his left, General Keane will create a diversion. On his right, General Gibbs will have the main column of attack and will have the job of storming over Line Jackson and taking that position. Down the center, General Lambert will bring up a column of reserve. He'll be there to throw his weight behind whatever action needs more troops.
Pakenham's plan is aggressive, but it's too complicated. He's got too many columns moving forward, and everything has got to be timed to perfection.
In the pre-dawn mist of January 8, 1815, the British begin their advance. From the start, problems plague Pakenham's troops. The muddy riverbanks slow the launching of the attack force. Once in the water, the swift current sends some boats too far downstream before they can reach the west bank. By the time they make it across the river, it will be too late to effect the battle. Elsewhere, the 44th Regiment, part of the main assault force, blunders.
The primary assault column is on the march, and the regiment that's supposed to carry the scaling ladders have forgotten them. They've left them behind. When they go back to get them, the column's already on the move.
At sunrise, the mist clears, exposing the oncoming British force, rocket fire lighting their way.
Press your lines.
Jackson calls to his men.
They are near enough now, gentlemen. You may fire when ready.
A Kentucky rifleman remembers how his fellow defenders responded to Old Hickory's orders.
Steady, boys. Hold your fire. Take aim! Fire!
Then the heavy iron cannon, and some thousands of small arms joined in and made the ground shake under our feet. As soon as the firing began, Captain Patterson came running along. He shouted, "Shoot low, boys! Shoot low! Break 'em!"
These Americans, instead of fleeing, stood there and decimated the British line. One cannon blast, they said, knocked out 100 British soldiers.
Second rank, advance!
And the Americans fired right into the faces of these men. It was like roaring hell, said one commentator.
The confusion in the British ranks spreads among one column led by General John Gibbs. Instead of rushing the Americans head-on, they pause to return fire, including the 44th Regiment. It is a fatal mistake witnessed by a British officer.
Instantly, the whole American line, from the swamp to the point past its center, was ablaze. In less time than one could write it, the 44th Foot was literally swept from the face of the earth.
Gibbs's column continues its advance. Soldiers scramble into the ditch in front of the American line, but without extra ladders, they cannot scale the rampart and become easy targets for Americans pouring fire directly into the column. Panic breaks out and erupts into widespread chaos. Gibbs rides forward to rally his wavering men, but gets caught in the deadly fire and falls from his horse, mortally wounded. Soon after, General Keane also goes down. As the British command begins to crumble, Jackson exudes a calm confidence, observing the battle near the center of the American line. But while the center and the left hold strong, the right remains vulnerable. British troops, led by Colonel Robert Rennie, managed to storm the rampart. Bayonets clash and gunshots fire at point-blank range in hand-to-hand fighting. At this crucial point in the battle, the British have their best chance to break through the American line. But without reinforcements, Rennie is a dead man as soon as he begins his charge.
The commanders of the two primary columns have been mortally wounded or killed. Other field officers are dead. There's no one left to command. Pakenham moves forward to try and rally retreating troops. He's hit in the knee. His horse is killed. His aide gets him another horse.
But another round of grape shot rings out. He's hit. This time, it's fatal. He's hit through the arm and the spine. He's hit in the lungs, and he falls to the ground dying. The British Army has lost its commander.
In just 20 minutes, the British High Command has been obliterated. The survivors realize they will never reach New Orleans and halt the attack. Improbably, Old Hickory's ragtag army has just trounced the world's best fighting force in little more than 2 hours.
When the battle was over and Jackson came out to see, the carnage, there were some men on the bottom, on the ground, who were still alive, and their arms and legs started to come up through the bodies of the men who had fallen on top of them. And Jackson said it reminded him of the resurrection, when the dead will rise from their graves. It was quite a scene.
More than 2,000 British soldiers have been killed, wounded, reported missing, or taken prisoner. Americans report only 13 dead and several dozen wounded.
There has never been in the annals of military history such a lopsided victory as Andrew Jackson had in defeating the British.
It made no sense. Who could believe such a victory? It proved to the American people for all time that, by God, they did have the ability and the will and the leadership to defeat any country that might try to invade us. It had been in question. No more, thanks to General Andrew Jackson and the men and women who fought in the Battle of New Orleans.
On February 4th, nearly 4 weeks after the battle, news of the victory reaches Washington. The capital goes wild. "Glory be to God that the barbarians have been defeated," blared a local newspaper. "Glory to Jackson. Glory to the militia, sons of freedom, benefactors of your country. All hail."
There's a new sense of national pride. There's a patriotic fervor where they're voicing things of American virtue and American purity and American values as they had not done since the Revolution.
9 days later, the peace delegation returns to Washington with the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812. The terms of the treaty merely restored territorial boundaries and maritime rights to what they were before the conflict. Ironically, the treaty doesn't resolve the chief cause, impressment, which had ceased to be an issue with the end of the Napoleonic War. Congress ratifies the treaty on February 17th.
This War of 1812 started for seemingly such small reasons, will end up defining modern America. This war will confirm manifest destiny. It will lead America into the new age.
The result of the war enormously changed the capacity of the United States to exist as an independent country under a Republican Constitution. John Adams himself said that Madison's conduct of the war and the way it ended gained more glory for the country than all of his 3 predecessors put together. John Adams was not used to giving praise when it wasn't deserved.
Both James Madison and Andrew Jackson, unlikely allies, are hailed as heroes. Despite their flaws, the strengths of these 2 men would reverberate far beyond the War of 1812. Together, they would embody the personification of a new republic.
These 2 very different men are able to bring Americans together and help them get through this very difficult time, because their leadership and their beliefs represent a very broad spectrum when you put them together. That's going to be the future of America.
News of the victory spreads a euphoric nationalism throughout the country. But not everyone is celebrating. Those who oppose the war are about to pay dearly. The Federalist delegates who had pushed for secession are labeled as traitors. But for Andrew Jackson, the savior of New Orleans, his heroic exploits catapult him from the battlefield to the White House as the nation's 7th president in 1829. His election confirms the coming of age of a new America, forged by men who shaped the times through which they passed.
The War of 1812 shouldn't be forgotten, because that's a turning point in the development of American democracy, American government, the American sense of who we are. It was the one moment that we needed psychologically to prove that we had a right to exist as an independent and free nation. And we did it at that time. After the War of 1812, we proved we were here to stay. And that's why I think it should be remembered by all Americans today.
History remembers the War of 1812 as the Forgotten War. It is a story of courage, endurance, and a little bit of luck. Forged by fire, united by will, a young nation defied the odds and won.